My name is Alex. I live with my wife Cecilia and my little daughter. I am from a valley in Mexico, and a long time ago I lived there in a small town in the mountains. It is a very small town with few inhabitants and very little public lighting. This started happening to us recently. You see, my wife and I were trying to have another baby. We tried for a long time, but we couldn't. So my wife chose to go with a woman from the town who is a healer and makes all kinds of potions for different illnesses, heartbreak among other things, to help her in some way to conceive. I know that for some it may seem somewhat ignorant on our part, but here in the town, it is very common since they have that type of belief. And I say they have because I was not completely convinced that that would work. What I wanted most was take my wife to the city with a good doctor to help us. But my wife refused repeatedly, saying that it was very expensive and that she had more faith in those types of remedies, if you can say. That afternoon we left our girl with a neighbor and headed to the house of that woman who lived even higher up in the mountains, in a house very far from the rest of the town. We arrived, and the first thing she told my wife was that she felt a very negative energy around her. She turned to look at me with a threatening look, then asked me to leave, saying that the one who wanted to conceive was my wife, and that I wasn't allowed in, that I should wait outside. So I left, but not before telling my wife that I would be there for anything she needed. About 40 minutes passed, and my wife still didn't come out, and I couldn't hear anyone either. It was getting darker and darker. I was afraid because we had to return on foot to the house, in the middle of the mountains and the deep darkness that there is in those places, only with the sound of animals in the background. So I encouraged myself and knocked on the door, but no one answered. 5 minutes passed and I knocked again, saying, "Cecilia, is everything okay? We have to go now." But what I received in return was a scream from that lady, telling me that I couldn't come in and that they would be done soon. I began to worry more and more. I was about to force my way in when I saw my wife coming out. She had a look of confusion on her face. I asked her, "Is everything okay?" She just nodded her head, saying yes, and she continued walking. The old woman didn't come out anymore. She just closed the door. We continued walking in total darkness. I asked her what that lady had told her, and why it had taken her so long in there, but she didn't know how to answer me. She looked very confused and told me she couldn't remember what had happened in there. I was surprised and asked her, "How come you don't remember anything? Did he do something to you?" But she told me no, that maybe she couldn't remember because she was already too tired and wanted to get home. Then she told me, "I only remember that the old lady gave me something to drink. She told me that it was a remedy that was going to help us conceive. After that, I can't remember anything else." I got worried, but I didn't want to say anything anymore because she looked very confused. We finally got home and I laid her down to rest. The next day we didn't bring up the topic, and I felt a little uncomfortable continuing to ask him, so I decided not to talk about it anymore. We continued with our daily routine. A few months passed, and finally the news we had been waiting for so long arrived. Cecilia was pregnant. I can't tell you how happy we both felt, but a few days after receiving the news, very strange things began to happen. One night we were about to go to bed. We turned off all the lights, and almost immediately we began to hear laughter and voices outside my house. They were women. I turned on the light and looked out the window, because it was not normal for someone to pass by there at that time. It was the highway, and only cars pass by during the day. There, it is very high in the mountains, and it is dangerous, so I looked out the window, but there was no one. It was quiet and dark. I was surprised to see that there was no one, because my wife and I clearly heard those voices and laughter. My wife asked me, "Who is outside?" I told him, "No one. There is no one." She looked at me with doubt, but told me that we should go to sleep because she was very tired. We turned everything off again, and shortly after the same laughter and ladies murmuring outside our house were heard again. But now we not only heard them, but we saw the shadows through the window. There were several women, and by their silhouette, you could see that they were old women with long messy hair, very thin, moving closer to our window, and the laughter was getting louder. I felt a chill all over my body that I can't explain. My wife looked terrified, unable to believe what she saw. She told me, "Who are they? What do they want?" I responded, swallowing my fear that I didn't know. I got up very slowly from the bed, trying not to make any noise, and slowly opened a part of the curtain to peek my eye out and be able to see out. But there was nobody. I opened the entire curtain, looking out from the sides, and I could see very clearly. Shadows on the ground, quickly moving away from my house, getting lost in the darkness of the road. And whatever it was floating, but I couldn't see anything else. I told my wife what I had seen, and the first thing she did was to go to see our daughter, but she was asleep in her room. So I picked her up and brought her to sleep with us. That night I didn't sleep taking care of my wife and my daughter, because I knew that something was not right, and that whatever was outside lurking around our home, it was something very dark. The days passed, and it was increasingly common to hear those women outside our house at night. We no longer knew what to do. We were desperate because we feared for our safety and that of our daughter, but we could never see anything until my wife thought we should take a priest to bless the house. And that's what we did. We took the village priest and told him what had been happening. When the priest arrived at our house, he turned to see me and said, "Son, there is something very evil here. I can feel it." I didn't know what to say. I just asked him why he thought that this was happening to us. If we were good people and believers in God, who had never done anything to invoke something evil, and he asked since when these things began to happen. I told him that since we found out that Cecilia was pregnant. He turned to look at me and asked if a strange event had happened before that. I told him about that lady who was a healer, that we had been there, and that she had given Cecilia a remedy so she could conceive. The father just closed his eyes and moved his head from one side to the other as if he was very worried. I asked him what was happening, and he told me that we had to leave there as soon as possible, that lady was a witch, who for many years had been doing satanic rituals with other witches who lived higher up, almost at the tip of the mountain, which they never went down because their appearance was terrifying, and they did not mix with normal people. They killed animals to eat, and they did not have electricity. They lived like in the 19th century, only with candles and bonfires. But for the most part they were known. It was because they liked to steal newborn babies and sacrifice them, to drink their blood, and thus rejuvenate themselves and become more powerful. At that time, there were many pregnant women already on the verge of giving birth missing, and there were so many disappearances that the inhabitants of the town took turns watching night after night, until one day in the afternoon, almost getting dark, a pregnant woman was walking home along the road. A man was watching from his house through the window, and he says he could see as 4 women came out of nowhere from the mountain. The man described them as almost elderly women, with a gloomy appearance, extremely thin, long gray and unkempt hair. They were all dressed in white, and their skin was almost attached to the bone. They came out from both sides of the road, cornering the woman. They looked at her belly, laughing in a chilling way. The man ran out of her house, alerting the neighbors, who immediately came out shouting at those old women to leave her alone. As soon as they saw them, those women, or whatever they were, ran away and got lost in the mountains. We all ran to help the girl, asking her if she was okay. She was in a state of shock. She couldn't speak for several days. The fear she felt was so much so that it left her unable to say a word because she saw them up close and could feel their evil, and how they were going for her baby who was still in her womb. All the inhabitants of the town went to look for them, to take justice into their own hands, but they never found them. It is said that they hide at the top of the mountains, from where they never come down unless they have a victim to hunt. And in this case, I think it is your wife. When you went to that lady's house, and she gave her that substance, it is most likely that they put her to sleep in order to call the others and do a ritual with the body of your wife, so that she could conceive and then be able to take away her baby. So, son, you have to leave immediately, because your wife and your baby are in great danger. I couldn't believe what was happening. I started crying and just kept repeating, "Why is this happening to us? We just wanted to be parents." The father just gave me a hug and told me, "Listen to me. Go away, as soon as possible." I didn't want to tell my wife everything that the father had told me, because I didn't want to scare her because of her pregnancy. I just told her that we had to go, that another company offered me a very good job at the city, and that we would live there for a while with my uncle. She was surprised and told me, "And when you were thinking of telling me we have our house here, I don't want to go live at someone else's house." I convinced her by saying that they were going to pay me very well, and that in time we would be able to buy our own house with a better quality of life in the city. So we started packing everything as we planned to leave the next day. Everything was ready, so we went to sleep. We hadn't long gone to bed when we heard laughter again outside our house, and already knowing what it was, it gave me a terror that I still can't explain. I took the Bible that the father had given me and pointed it at the window, shouting, "Get out of here. You are not welcome, leave." My wife looked at me with a doubtful face. She asked me who was there, what was happening. I didn't answer her, and I continued yelling at them to get out, and I only received mocking laughter from behind the window, and they got closer until I could see their shadows. At that point, I was more angry than afraid. So I got up from the bed, opened the window, and there they were. 4 women, dressed in white with gray hair, a face with skin stuck to the bone, deep circles under their eyes. All of them were barefoot, slowly approaching my window, looking at me and smiling. My wife screamed so loud that my daughter started crying. I kept pointing the Bible at the window, telling them to get out of my house, that it was blessed and that they couldn't enter. But it seemed like they didn't care. They kept laughing with that creepy laugh so terrifying that I can still hear it at night when I sleep. I closed the curtains and called the father, who told me that he was going to my house, that for nothing in the world we should ever think of leaving there, or opening the window again. The 3 of us waited patiently, hugging each other, me trying to calm my wife and daughter, telling them that everything would be fine, that the father was already on his way, but they continued crying, uncontrollably terrified. To be honest, I was too, but I had to be strong to be able to calm my family a little. Minutes passed when finally we heard the father's truck arrive. It came with another priest. We only heard them rebuking them with prayers, and we could hear how those witches were walking away, mocking the priests. Suddenly nothing was heard. The father knocked on my door and told me, "Son, open up for me. Those witches are no longer here." I ran to open the door for them. I hugged him, crying, thanking him for coming to help us, because if it hadn't been for them, I don't know what would have happened. They stayed all night at my house, and we all stayed awake in the living room waiting for dawn because no one could sleep. As soon as it was dawn, we put all our baggage in the truck and left there, leaving our entire life, home, and friends in that town that had seen us grow up. But I can't explain to you the calmness we felt when we left there and arrived at the city. Here we started a new life with our children. We never heard about those witches again. We had our baby, and now he is a beautiful 6-year-old boy. We are very calm and happy, but without a doubt, That bitter pill that we live in that town with those witches. We will never forget. A few months ago, we found out that the priest who helped us had died, and a friend of ours from the town, without knowing what had happened to us, told us that the father gathered the entire town after we left to alert people about some women who were stealing newborn children, and that they should be alert, as well as almost forbidding everyone from going with that healer's house because she was a bad person. He didn't go into details, he just told us to take care of each other, and for no reason to neglect our babies, or pregnant women. My wife and I no longer knew what had happened to those witches, if they are still there, if they had already died, or if they continue to spread evil in town. What we are sure of is that we will never return. If you are enjoying it, I would greatly appreciate your like and subscription. Let's continue. Hello everyone, I'm Julia, and this story took place many years ago when I was little. I lived in a town near Guadalajara with my parents and my older brother Peter. Near our house, about 4 blocks away, there was a large lake, around the size of 6 full blocks, and on the other side of the lake there was nothing but forest, dense vegetation and some animals. Without a doubt, it was the perfect place to play with my friends from the neighborhood. Every day we would gather in front of the lake, where there were some playgrounds and plenty of space to run around. But the lake had a dark side. Every night, as the sun was almost set, on the far side of the lake deep within the forest, some women would gather. They would light a fire and chant strange prayers and songs. All the parents in the area had forbidden us from going anywhere near that place. Before the sun went down, we had to be back home, or else we would face scoldings and severe punishments. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal if I got home a little late, but eventually I figured it out. My older brother Peter, who was 19 at the time, had a group of friends he would hang out with in front of the lake. But one day one of them disappeared. My brother told my parents that the last time they saw him was when he left one of his friends' houses late, around 10 p.m. His name was John, and he lived on the other side of the lake, but he never made it home. They searched everywhere for him. His parents filed a report with the police, but days turned into weeks, and he was never found. My parents grew more and more worried because the boy had disappeared right in our own neighborhood. They became increasingly paranoid, and for good reason, because another young man who lived just 3 houses down from us also vanished one day without a trace. The last thing anyone heard was that he had gone to the lake to retrieve his backpack but never came back. All the neighbors were concerned because the boys who were disappearing were grown and strong. Who could have taken them? We found out the answer later when my brother's best friend Rodolfo returned home one day covered in scratches on his arms, chest, and face. He was in such a state of shock that he couldn't speak until the next day, when he finally recounted what had happened to him. He said he was coming back from his girlfriend's house. It was 11 p.m., and he was crossing the lake. It was completely dark and silent, except for the sound of the wind when he saw an elderly woman beckoning him. She was an older lady, but not too old. He described her as being around 60 years old. When he saw that she was calling him, he asked, "Are you okay?" She replied that she was fine, but needed help because her grocery bags had ripped and she couldn't carry everything on her own. So Rodolfo politely went to help her. He said the bushes around her made it hard to see clearly, so he could only see her from the waist up. When he got closer, he noticed that there was nothing on the ground. No groceries. Nothing. When he looked up at the woman, he said her face completely changed. Her gaze became cold and piercing, and he could see that her nails were long, almost like animal claws. Seeing this, Rodolfo tried to run, but when he turned around, he found himself surrounded by more elderly women, all staring at him and closing in with their sharp, enormous nails. He tried to run, but he couldn't. They grabbed him by the arms and legs, leaving him unable to move. He struggled to free himself, but all he got in return were more scratches. They told him it was pointless to resist, that he would never leave, that he belonged to them now, and that he shouldn't worry. It would all be over sooner than he thought. Of course, the only thing he could think was, they're going to kill me. They dragged him deep into the forest, tied him up completely, and placed him near a fire. Then they all began taking off their clothes and performing rituals, speaking in languages he didn't understand and rubbing the blood they had drawn from his scratches all over their bodies. He was terrified, but he didn't lose hope of escaping. He looked around and saw strange figures made from tree branches and some animal bones, or at least that's what he thought they were. He was starting to lose hope, though. The witches, having finished their ritual, picked up a sharp branch and began approaching him slowly. Rodolfo knew what was about to happen. He closed his eyes tightly. Suddenly he heard a shout. It was from some men on horseback yelling at the women to let him go. The women grabbed their clothes and ran off. The men approached, untied him, and asked if he was okay, but Rodolfo couldn't say a word. He was in a state of shock. And who wouldn't be, knowing they were moments away from death? The men took him home, following the directions he pointed out with his finger. They left him at the door, knocked, and rode off. I suppose they didn't want to get involved in any trouble. When his parents opened the door and saw Rodolfo covered in blood, with his clothes torn and in shock, his mother started crying and asking what had happened, but he couldn't say anything. When he finally told them everything that had happened, his father went to the police to file a report. Everyone knew it was those women who gathered at night with their bonfire on the far side of the lake, but they were never found. The police searched the area and, sure enough, found the figures that Rodolfo had mentioned hanging from the trees, made with animal bones and human bones. They analyzed them, and sadly, one of the bones matched my brother's friend who had disappeared without a trace. Another belonged to our neighbor, who had also vanished. They never found those witches. The story was published in the newspaper, warning the community to be careful, and to call the police if they ever saw those women. But years passed, and no one ever found them. It's a story that marked our lives. For a long time, my brother stopped going out because he was scared, afraid that the next victim would be him. Let's continue. This happened when I was little. I lived with my parents and my two brothers in a small one-story house. My brothers and I slept in a room where the window faced the street. My youngest brother, who was only 5 years old, would wake us up every night because he was always at the window, talking to someone outside. We would put him back to bed and go back to sleep. This went on for some time until one night I asked him who he was talking to. I thought he would say it was an imaginary friend or something like that, but no. He told me he was talking to a lady who gave him candy and told him to come with her so she could give him toys, but that he shouldn't tell anyone. This scared me a lot, so I told my parents. When they heard this, they stormed out of the house, heading straight to the corner house, an old dirty place that I had always thought was abandoned. They pounded on the door so hard that it must have echoed down the whole block. I didn't know what was happening. Suddenly the door cracked open, and an old woman peeked out. She scared me instantly just by looking at her, though I didn't know why. She looked unkempt, with gray hair that was dirty and wild, dark circles under her eyes, wearing worn-out clothes, and she had a defiant look and a mocking smile, as if she knew why my parents were there. They confronted her because they knew she was the one who had been standing outside our window every night, talking to my little brother. She had that reputation. Rumor had it she was a witch and had kidnapped several children over the years. She lured them with candy and gifts, took them to her house, and they were never seen again. When the old woman heard my parents' accusations, she let out a long, eerie laugh, mocking them. Her laugh was sinister. My parents only warned her to stay away from us and then left. The next night, right at 3 a.m., I woke up. I had the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to look at my little brother's bed, but he wasn't there. I checked my other brother's bed, but he wasn't with him either. So I got up to look for him, thinking he might have gone to the bathroom, but I couldn't find him. I knew something terrible was happening, so I immediately alerted my parents. They jumped out of bed, panicked, and we began searching the whole house, even though it wasn't very big. My dad ran outside calling his name, but after a while he came back inside crying and telling my mom. She took our son. My mother went pale. They understood each other instantly and knew what was happening. She asked anxiously, "How do you know? Did you see her?" My dad grabbed her by the arm and led her to the old woman's house, so I followed them. The door was open and we went inside. I immediately felt like vomiting. There were animal remains scattered everywhere. The smell was nauseating, and strange symbols were drawn on the walls. On the table there were bizarre amulets made with hair and bound figures. But as we kept searching, suddenly my parents let out a heartbreaking scream that sends chills down my spine every time I remember it. They found my little brother's pajama shirt, but there was no trace of him or of the witch. They had vanished without a trace, and we never saw him again. We filed a police report, searched everywhere for years, looking for him and that witch who we knew had taken him, but we never found them. Over time, my mother fell into a deep depression. She gradually deteriorated until she became ill and passed away. My father is now old, but even so, he never loses hope that one day my brother will walk through the door. Though we both know that's not going to happen. Deep down, we always knew that the witch had used him, just as she used all the children she stole to make herself young again. And after that, she simply made them disappear. Now I'm an adult, and I have 3 children. I was so traumatized by that event that there are no windows in my house, and my children sleep with us in the same room. They don't understand it yet, and I know they'll grow up soon and need their privacy, but I won't take my eyes off them. I know I sound paranoid and overprotective, but I just want to make sure that the story doesn't repeat itself, and that no witch will ever come close to spying on my children, only to disappear with them afterward.